Hi everyone, I wanted to show you how I made these rings using 3/4 inch plywood. I made these rings using a router and the guard that came with it. I'm attaching this piece of wood to the guard and that'll be my jig. I've put a pin in the piece of wood and now I'll attach it to the jig, and that will give me the center point for cutting all my circles. I'll put this jig back on my router now, and you can see how that pin will act as the center pivot point. If you don't have a guard like this for your router, you can just make a jig as well. Okay, let's cut some rings. Here's my workspace. You can see I've got some scrap material underneath my 3/4 inch plywood. The first step will be laying out the location for all my rings, and I've got a round template for that. The important part is that the circles are not too close together, and the template also has a center hole, and I'll be drilling the center hole for each of the rings, and that's where the center pin will go. I need 8 of these rings for my project, but I'll be making 9. I always like to have an extra. Once I've laid them all out, the next step is to put some screws through the plywood and into that waste material. When I'm using the router, I don't want the plywood or the waste material to move at all. I'll be setting the depth gauge on my router to 3 different heights, so I'll make the rings in 3 passes instead of 1 single pass. Because I'm using a corded router, I'll go in opposite directions each time I make a pass, and that'll keep my cord from getting tangled. Also to note here, I am cutting the outer circle first, and then I'll move on to the inner circle to complete the ring. In order to have a consistent size and also to be a little bit more efficient, I'll cut all my outer rings first and then move on to my inner ring. Compared to some of the other ways people have made videos on making rings, you can see that this method with the router is so far quite straightforward. Here's a good tip. I'm using a corner of my project plywood to cut a section of the ring, and I'll use this in order to test the inner circle and make sure I get exactly the size of ring that I want before making some real cuts. I made a few adjustments until I had the exact 1.5 inch width I wanted for my ring. Again, this step is invaluable. Now that I have my jig set exactly where I want, I'll go ahead and cut the inner ring. That earlier step we took to secure the plywood to the scrap material is paying off now. As these pieces are cut, nothing is moving and about as safe as you can be. If you're wondering what project I have that I need all these rings, my nephew is a rock climber and he's asked for some gymnastics rings for strength training. So that will be the next video that I make to finish these off. Please leave your comments as well. I'd love to hear feedback from anybody watching these videos.